we have Katie Schlosser, an upper school English teacher, and she's a BA lifer. She graduated at the end of the last century. I've been waiting to say that. So, having graduated from Brookfield Academy, she went on to the University of Notre Dame, where she was in the program of liberal studies, which is really based on the Great Books program, right? That was started earlier in the 20th century in Columbia, New York. So it's a great program where you are in small groups and really get to discuss and dig into the literature of the West, and I guess some of the East as well, right? And see how it all plays together with philosophy, science, theology, political theory, the fine arts. So she's the perfect person to sort of bring us all together here on Western Civ, although it's a giant topic. Then she went on to get her Master's of Arts in the Humanities at the University of Chicago. Then she began her teaching career in Chicago, or in Illinois rather, at Lake Forest Academy. And then happily, we finally got her back, and now she's been teaching in the upper school in the English department for several years now. So please join me in welcoming Katie Schlosser. Oh, you're going to have to fill them in on field hockey. And also, probably your Latin teacher, right?
Yes.
Yes, I think I was her Latin teacher, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Linda. She taught me Latin in sixth grade, and sixth grade, and geography. So thank you. As Linda mentioned, the topic for my talk is absurd. I told my stepfather the title, and he just sort of raised an eyebrow and said, "That sounds like a lot of research." And what was sort of unstated in his comment is that it's nearly impossible in 40 minutes to try to talk about the whole phenomenon of Western civilization. So what I really want to do is focus in on providing a little bit of a fresh understanding, perhaps, of what we mean when we say the term Western civilization. Some people may have been well-formed in this and are kind of aware of what is meant. But we use the term at Brookfield Academy, and we use it in a very deliberate way. And for fun, just the other night, I did a Twitter search of the term Western civilization. And what I discovered, what I suspected was true. It's a very controversial term right now as well. So I think it's fruitful for us to take a look at what at least perhaps we mean when we say this term. The other thing I want to address is the concept of technology. And I want to acknowledge that the greatest technological innovation birthed by Western civilization is not the smartphone. It is the book. And we're going to take a look at how long it took for this entire process to develop. And I hope that little, I don't know what to call it, segue or that focal point will actually give us some hope about the condition or the state of Western civilization, which again, according to my Twitter search, people are either thrilled that it is about to fail or terrified that it is about to fail. But everyone sort of feels this sense of doom. So perhaps we can dial that back a little bit. But then the final thing is we have to acknowledge that our civilization, or Western civilization, as we've acknowledged it or spoken about it, it has changed rapidly, particularly in the last, I'd say, 300 years. The way that human beings live today is so radically different from how human beings lived for thousands of years. And this introduces some exciting possibilities for, human nature and human civilization, but also a lot of uncertainty. And so we're going to try to look at what it is that we can do as teachers and parents and citizens to sort of identify what is special or important about Western civilization, and how can I pass that on to future generations. So that's the goal. We'll see. So the first thing I want to do is just review. Can I make it? Can you just hit me forward?
It's not even doing that.
All right.
Life is good in
It's okay.
technology world. There we go.
It's just pictures. Okay, can you click it again?
Yeah.
All right. So I hope you can read this, but
I'll go back.
thank you. That's okay.
I probably
Base-
overclicked.
Basically, when people talk about the concept of Western civilization, they're talking about this very peculiar fusion of four basically different forces. And it took almost 600 years for these forces to actually come together into any kind of unity. So those four forces are Hellenism, which is the term used to describe Greek philosophy, science, literature, art, politics. Hellenism, the influence of Hellenism cannot be overstated. It is perhaps the most beneficial civilization that has ever existed, the Greeks. Now, the second element is the Roman Empire. Because if we think about the Greeks, if you could just go forward once, it's a poor quality photo, but if we go forward once, this is sort of the height of the Greek empires, the various city-states, peaked around maybe 500 to 300 BC. But if we click forward again and we just remember where Greece is, like this is over here, and its primary sphere of influence was actually what we would now call the East. So the question becomes then, like, how did this Hellenism become transported to Europe? And that's where, if you go back again, that's where the Roman Empire comes in. The Romans essentially stole all that was great from the Greeks, and thank God they did, because then they used their tremendous organizational and military genius to spread, essentially, Greek ways of thinking, particularly the political, across Europe. The third thing is the European people. Now, I say the European people because Europe as a civilization, they definitely contributed to Western civilization, but what they contributed primarily was DNA. What we're going to see is they also contributed, of course, their tribal sense of loyalty, which actually was an important part of how civilization as we know it today came to be. But just to keep it in perspective, the peoples in Europe that had been there since the early Bronze Age were of no interest to the great civilizations of Greece and the East. The European peninsula was known, but largely ignored. And it was feared, partly because of the savagery and the mystery of the peoples that lived in that region. And most, you can think of Alexander the Great, he didn't have any interest in conquering Europe. He had interest in conquering Africa and the East and Asia. This was where the civilizations of human beings were strong. This is where trade was strong. This is where, this is where there was wealth, etc. So it wasn't until a very ambitious but foolhardy individual named Julius Caesar decided to show off and try to conquer Europe. And it was both a stroke of total genius and a disaster. He simultaneously introduced the European peoples to Roman civilization and destroyed the Roman Empire by overstretching it into this region of hostile people. But we are eternally grateful to Julius Caesar for making this crazy decision to try to conquer the European peoples. And then the final piece of the puzzle for Western civilization is the introduction of what is an Eastern form of spirituality known as Christianity. And I say that it's Eastern. I like to remind people that this is one of the curious elements of Western civilization, is that it is a form of, I guess, cultural appropriation at its finest. It is a mixture of contradictory elements that were brought together over a long series of hundreds of years and produced something new. But to produce something new, we all know we need fresh ingredients. And one of the key ingredients was essentially an Eastern religion that was filtered then through the Judaic tradition and the concept of law. The Jewish people were Romanized, and this helped spread then Christianity through what had been the former Roman Empire. But anyways, so just by way of a quick reminder, could you click again? Okay, yeah, this is good. So I just wanted to just remind us of like the area that we're talking about, and it's relatively small, I guess, to us now, but this was the known world. And you can see that the Roman Empire was, certainly it started in Italy, but somewhat ironically, Italy was one of the more fragile parts of the empire because of its proximity to all of these the Visigoths and the Franks and the Alemannia and the Lombards and all of these barbarian tribes that were constantly threatening the Roman Empire. So they had actually a much firmer hold over Greece and Asia. And anyways, so just as a reminder, so this is the area, and you can go forward or back one maybe, if you see. At a certain point, everything that is colored and indicated here, this is the height of the Roman Empire. So just a reminder that the Romans did actually conquer all of Europe. You can see there's one area that they just couldn't penetrate. Oh, Germania. Yes, a sign of things to come. But yeah, the German tribes were the most complex. They had the highest level civilization. Therefore, they were the least, attracted to the Roman way of life, and the most difficult to conquer. It really wasn't until, I believe, the 800s that the European now forces made any real foray into the German tribes. But I point this out, and we just take, just to reflect for a moment. Again, what we're talking about when we talk about Western civilization then is a geographical location, which is largely understood to be Europe. It is a philosophy and a concept of law that is Greek in origin. It is a civic organization and a power for organization that is Roman. And it is a spirituality that is Christian. Now, as we consider this, we have to realize these elements at one point were all in conflict with one another. Could you flick forward for me? Again. Thank you. Again. So, I just want to point out that think about the first few hundred years of Christian-Roman relations. It was not good. They were sworn enemies, and those of us who have, gone to Sunday school or read the history of Christianity can easily recall the centuries-long persecution of Christianity, because the Roman Empire understood very clearly what a threat Christianity was to the strength of the empire. What was that threat? This was a people who appealed not to material wealth, not to violence, not to power, but to protecting the weak, to providing for the poor. This spoke precisely to the population of the Roman Empire that was undoing it before their very eyes, the disaffected, the disenfranchised lower classes of the non-aristocratic Romans. So Christianity was a legitimate threat to the power of the Roman Empire. They knew this. And it wasn't until, of course, Constantine converted the whole of the Roman Empire to Christianity that we saw these two opposing forces actually come together. But I like to just pause and consider how bizarre that is, that these two sworn enemies of one another became one and the same. It is interesting, just for a moment, we retain some of this. I mean, it's called the Roman Catholic Church. We use this term so frequently we forget its origins. What the early Christians discovered when they were in Europe is that the citizens there respected the Roman Empire. They had been conquered by them. They admired their capacity for civic organization. They loved their written language. And these early Christians were able to actually use the authority of Rome to convert. So it's, anyway, so that's one thing. I just want us to understand that there are a lot of contradictions and tensions built in to the entire construction of Western civilization. And this quotation just reminds us that this is from an historian, Christopher Dawson, who talked about how strange it was that in the Middle Ages, it was the churchmen and the men of letters, it was the churchmen and the scholars, rather than the princes and statesmen who cherished the ideal of the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, if we stop for a second, it was actually the priests and the scholars who were preaching the Roman ideals of equality and freedom, not the local kings. And so that is just, to the modern mind, where we live in this kind of separation of church and state, if we go back and really, it's so bizarre. And we could spend a lot of time reflecting on that, but alas, we have to move on. So the last thing I wanted to point out is I don't know what's happening there. There we go. So the last thing that was up there is I also just like to point out that this process of sort of combining these four different forces, Hellenism, the Roman Empire, Christianity, and the European people, the first indication that there was any cooperation or fusion between these four elements, it took about 600 years to reach that point. The first example of that we see is actually in England and Ireland. This is where Irish people get excited about the book, How Ireland Saved Western Civilization. Have you guys heard that? Yeah, okay, they've got a slight point. I'm not going to get into it. You can read that book if you would like. But the idea is that it took 600 years. The first Christians were, as I said, for the most part, a conquered people who accepted Christianity because it was, at that time, the Roman faith. But they were not great Christians. Can you imagine explaining Jesus to a Visigoth? It did not go well. The concepts of Christianity, it took several generations. And there are some really beautiful stories about how these cultures slowly began over the course of hundreds of years to understand more of what the Judeo-Christian ethic is. So now I want to point out, now I want to take a little turn into reading. And my argument essentially is that this unity was achieved through two forces that are actually related. The two forces I want to call attention to are Christianity and literacy. Now, you guys are probably well aware intuitively that literacy and Christianity go hand in hand. What is the most influential book ever written? Yes, the Bible. Christianity and Judaism and Islam are religions with holy scriptures. This is distinct. Not all faith traditions have scripture. In other words, words that have been recorded that are considered to be divinely inspired. And that the study of those words yields an understanding of the divine. This is remarkable. So I say again, I wish I could spend more time talking more about sort of the Roman Empire and Greek philosophy and how this all mixed together, because I'm oversimplifying it. But we can't ignore these two forces as being so important in the foundations of Western civilization. So, hold on one second. Yeah. So, before we get to that, I want to just, so now that we've established that these two forces, Christianity and literacy, are linked, we should pause for a moment and reflect on written language and language throughout the history of Western civilization and what came before it. Well, we know, the ancient Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, Chinese cultures, every culture developed some form of writing. But writing, if you look at the Sumerians, for example, it was very confusing. Why? They were attempting to depict events in a sort of shorthand that was picture-based, right? That's kind of what hieroglyphs are, right? It's miniature pictures of things that are happening. It wasn't until the Greeks that human beings decided that it would be a little bit more efficient to create a code. What is the code? Every letter stands for a sound. Just stop and think about that. Every letter stands for a sound. Language was oral. It was never written. We actually cannot even conceive of what that must have been like. But there was no concept of words or paragraphs or sentences prior to writing. And it was the Greeks that figured out, with their beautiful tiny alphabet, how to actually efficiently record what people were saying by making up symbols that stood for sounds, not for images and not for concepts. So that's how you were able to develop a very efficient form of recording what was being said. Instead of having an alphabet of 8,000 hieroglyphs that required a professional class of scribes to learn, understand, and transmit, you could actually pretty efficiently record what was being said. And so what we have here are examples of Roman writing. So I just want you guys to take a look, though. This is called the Roman cursive, which was their handwritten form. And then this is the formal Roman letters, the all capitals that was used in public spaces. But if we look at this, can anyone just tell me what is unusual, different, besides the form of the letters? Why is this really difficult to read? Okay, it's in Latin. Linda, have you got it for us?
There's no space between the words.
There's no space between the words. Why not? Why wouldn't there be any punctuation? Oral tradition. It was all about inflection. There was no punctuation, right? This is the very beginnings of a literate civilization. They just were recording what people sounded like. There were no like words, okay? There was just sounds. And so what happened was basically writing became more efficient because they were able to record more of what people were saying and it was more easily transmitted. But it was still really hard to decode. So there was still a professional class of scribes who were experts at this. And what they were experts at was performing these pieces. They didn't care about word order. We can't even comprehend that. They didn't care about word order because it was all about inflection and rhythm, which, as we know from public speaking, is really important. It was all about inflection and rhythm. The word order didn't even matter. This is why actually Latin teachers now are like, well, the word order, right?
It drives kids crazy.
It drives them nuts because, and what they don't realize is like, that's because word order, a lot of Latin, Roman, it wasn't written down, it wasn't read, it wasn't a fully literate culture. So now this is where we kind of go from how this developed into the kind of writing that we have today. There should be a slide with the Carolinian script. Yeah. So this is taken from the 9th century in Gaul or France. And long story short, because Christianity is a religion of the word and the scripture, there was great care taken, of course, to write and distribute these texts. And it was, yes, the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish, the English, who were particularly poised to develop this skill. One of the reasons that they were able to become very good at essentially writing was a group of Greek and Syrian bishops took a lot of just artisans and artists from Rome and went to England. So there's a lot of interesting fusion. If you look at Celtic art, some of it is the original Celtic tribe, but if you look at it, it almost looks Arabic at times. That's because it is. These Syrian monks brought with them High Eastern art, a civilization that at that time was far superior to anything in the West. And the Irish and English sort of merged it into their art forms. But anyways, these groups of people became particularly skilled at this for a variety of reasons. They were terrible at governing, though, the Anglo-Saxons. It wasn't until they sort of met up with the Gauls, the French, who were quite good at governing an organization, that there began to be a systematic attempt to distribute the correct form of the scripture. This was the concern. Charles I, he saw that people had the wrong prayers because people had misunderstood what had been written and then copied the wrong thing. It was like a game of telephone gone horribly wrong. So he undertook this great project to redistribute all of the Holy Scriptures and prayers across the European church. And what they realized they had to do is they had to develop a way of writing that was easier to read. And that is when they developed the lowercase letters and punctuation and spacing between words, which you can see is still not quite there. But this is more recognizable as our literary form of writing. So if you could go forward now. So now the thing I want to point out about reading now, I think you've seen that it is amazing when we stop and consider how many centuries it took for us to develop something that we take for granted, something that we demand our 5-year-olds do. And we have to stop and just appreciate that actually reading is the most complex cognitive task that we ask humans to do. And here's just a little bit as to why that is. The language on a page is a code for a group of sounds. that are then supposed to represent some form of reality, but then also be organized into a logical paragraph or sentence that then communicates some abstract idea about the human condition. It is mind-boggling. So, and I mentioned, I like to read, this is a really beautiful moment that records sort of the amazement of people in the early days of reading. This is from the biography of St. Augustine. So he was writing in the year 380 in Africa, and he stumbled upon his teacher, Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. This is what Augustine came in one day, and he saw Ambrose doing this. His eyes scanned the page, and his heart explored the meaning. But his voice was silent, and his tongue was still. So what Augustine is seeing for the first time in his life is somebody reading to themselves. He could not figure it out. He goes on and he says that often when we came to see him, we found him reading like this in silence, for he never read aloud. And we wondered whether he, quote, needed to spare his voice, which quite easily became hoarse. So actually, you know, in Augustine's life, like silent reading never really became a thing. And first of all, because it was extremely difficult, as we saw. You had to have mastered so many different skills to be able to do it. But it also just made no sense to these. Why would you do this? Now, the second thing I want to pay attention to, though, is that as the practice of reading or of writing more clearly, physically writing more clearly with words and punctuation, as that spread, so too did the ability to read it. And so before Gutenberg enters the scene, this is usually the quick shortcut we take, we actually have a 600-year period of time to appreciate in which the technology of literacy was developing. And I want to just call attention to some of the effects of reading alone. So this is the medieval bishop, Isaac of Syria, who says that he's describing how he felt when he read alone. This was like a new experience for him. It's kind of like what we're doing now when we're like on Twitter or something. Like, what is this experience? He says that whenever he read to himself, he felt he was in a dream. I enter a state when my sense and thoughts are concentrated. Then, with the prolonging of the silence, the turmoil of memories is stilled in my heart. Ceaseless waves of joy are sent me by inner thoughts beyond expectation, suddenly arising to delight my heart. Okay. So I wish we could spend more time on this, but essentially what is being described is the birth of a new kind of self-consciousness. The ability to read silently is very peculiar. You are alone, yet with somebody, the text. Your mind, your conscious mind is empty. Like you lose track of like whether or not you have things to do, or are you hungry, or what time is it? Those things disappear when we're reading. Yet our mind is not empty, right? It is instead filled with the world of the text. So so what happened was essentially we've got the development of what we call now the literary mind, which is the mind that we have inherited. The mind that takes for granted the capacity to think discursively, which means across many different concepts at once. We also take for granted that the individual mind can debate with itself and with a text. This was new. In an oral tradition, the person in authority was the teacher. They would speak, and you would listen. There was no text with which you could interact. You couldn't question the teacher. So another really significant effect of reading and reading to oneself, and it sounds like an overstatement, but it's quite true, is the development of democracy. Democracy depends on a group of people who are capable of thinking with themselves about ideas we have in common. Thinking with themselves, so you take your Bill of Rights and you go off by yourself, and you consider them with the author of those rights, but also with yourself. And without this capacity to read or write, we also really would not have enjoyed the scientific revolution. The types of complexity that these thinkers were engaged in the 15th century, the types of logic, it required books, pages upon pages upon pages of arguments that extended over immeasurable complexity that was beyond simply the oral mind to appreciate and understand. So could you go forward? A couple. So I mentioned just quickly that this then explains that even Encyclopedia Britannica says that probably the greatest achievement, the most original achievement of Western civilization is the university. And I use this just to wrap up. What is the university? It is this peculiar institution that, at least in its founding, was related to Christianity, but it was not part of the church. How did that happen? Well, in the 1100s, as these centers of study and learning began to develop, they were located in England and France and Italy, and because of these warring different groups of tribes, it was dangerous to travel. So the church wanted to make sure that the scholars could meet with one another, so they granted them a particular type of immunity from national interference. And they also recognized that the work they were doing was so burdensome that they couldn't really be priests. So what we had is the beginning of what we now call professors. And it's not a coincidence. Could you go forward? This is the first university. It's in Italy, in Bologna, 1088. It's not a coincidence that on graduation day, we all look like a gospel choir or priests or something. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from this peculiar role. It was called the doctor, who was neither a man of the church nor a man of the world. He occupied instead this free space, which was, of course, dedicated to studying theology, but which also, of course, embraced all of the liberal arts, all the other areas of study. And because of the independence of the university, the Western civilization was really able to give birth to the whole concepts of academic freedom, of academic independence, and when we, of course, continue to enjoy that today. I don't think it's a coincidence that at a school that professes to admire Western civilization, the golden ticket that we promise you at the end of 14 years is what? University. This is peak Western civilization right here. Yeah, so just last slide, and then I'm pretty much, I'll take some questions. But what I wanted to just call our attention to, so as we reflect back on all of this, kind of what can we take away from it? Well, first of all, is just a little bit of humility when we consider Western civilization, that it's 2,000 years. It's this incredibly complex process. And this historian, Christopher Dawson, he was British. He was writing mostly in between the wars and after World War II. But one of the things that he said is, for nearly 2,000 years, Europe had been taught in the same school and by the same masters, so that the schoolboy and the undergraduate of the 19th century were still reading the same books and conforming their minds to the same standards as their Roman predecessors 1,800 years before. So what Dawson was trying to explain is the phenomenon of European cultural unity. And what he had recognized is that it was basically they were all reading the same syllabus for 2,000 years. They were reading Plato. They were reading Aristotle. They were reading the Bible. They were studying Aquinas. And it didn't matter if you were English or French or German or Italian. You pretty much all read a very similar series of texts. So, could you go forward once more? Mm-hmm. So, what do we do with this? Well, the first thing I would say is that we need to love Brookfield Academy for trying to teach this to our students. It's difficult. It's a complex history. My students often even say, they'll complain. They're like, why can't we study anything about, and I say, I'm like, well, look, Western civilization, it's not necessarily the best. It's not superior inherently, but it's us. And self-knowledge is the first step. We need to understand who we are as a civilization. Then you can critique it. So that's what I tell them. I'm like, look, it's so complicated and it's so hard and you're so young. You've got to just learn this now. You can go to college and then learn whatever you want. But right now, we're going to focus on who you are and who we are as a civilization. The other thing is just to encourage students to pursue the liberal arts. And that's another talk. We'll talk about that later. But really, we have to realize that the current technological innovations that we're experiencing as a civilization is not necessarily our greatest technological advancement. I would argue that it is still reading and that it is still the literary mind. That this gave birth to the scientific mind. So what do we do with that? I would say that we recognize that the maintenance and continuation of the literary mind become something of concern for us as preservers and inheritors of Western civilization. And what I mean by the literary mind is essentially a mind that is able to focus and piece together several complex arguments. This is only possible with reading. And the human brain is actually not really designed to do this. It takes practice and effort. Anthropologists have discovered, and neuroscience has discovered, that we are actually geared towards distraction. This is what helped us stay alive. We're trained to sort of always be looking around and checking for predators and whatnot. And this capacity for sustained focus and thought that makes possible many of our jobs and our sciences, that this is something that has to be trained, that has to be taught. It's not natural. And unfortunately, this is why smartphones and the internet are so compelling. It is because they appeal actually to our brain's natural tendency towards distraction. And it's so powerful that the University of Lancaster just came out with a study that's pretty terrifying. They compared what people self-reported was their smartphone use versus what it actually was. We have no idea how much we use. And actually, we're incapable of being honest with ourselves about our smartphone use because it is so instinctive. So I don't know what to make of this. It's not necessarily doom and gloom, but I think we can make our homes and our family spaces places where reading is possible. And I don't think I have to go into too many practical notes, but I can share a quick anecdote. I lived with my parents last year yes, in my late 30s, while I redid my home. And I'm an English teacher. I've been an English teacher for 15 years. I'm supposed to read a lot, right? Well, I read more last winter than I have in 10 years. And here's why. My parents read. I would see them read, and I'm like, well, I guess it's reading time. Reading is an individual activity, but it is socially supported. This is very clear through our experience of school, university, book clubs, etc. Socially support your family in the act of reading. The other thing is to read aloud to your kids, even when they're older. And audiobooks are a great way to do this on road trips. The final thing is, I didn't talk about it a great deal, but I hope you noticed that as we looked at the origin and the fusion and the bringing together of all these different elements in Western civilization, that Christianity certainly played a tremendous role in that. And it's undeniable, as I have studied Western civilization, that every civilization requires a very powerful spiritual foundation. And that every civilization needs to answer some of the important questions of human existence. Why am I here? What is good? What is evil? What is the best kind of life? These are questions that everybody has, and they need to be given some kind of attention, some kind of response. Whatever shape that takes, no culture has ever survived a loss of its spiritual foundations. And so I would just encourage all of us to reflect on that. We're not a religious institution by any stretch, but we're also an institution that consciously acknowledges that that is an important element of our civilization and of our unity as a civilization. So that's all I have.